Thanks so much. Okay, last talk of the day. Thank you for hanging out, hanging in there. So we're going to keep it kind of lighthearted, right? Because it is the last talk of the day. So, all right, so let's get started. So everybody here recognizes these things, templates, components, and services. So I'm going to be talking about templates, components, and services in your Angular applications. And so just to be specific, when I say template, I mean the HTML part of the component. And when I say component, unless I say otherwise, I mean the TypeScript part of the component. And then services are your injectable classes that have the provided in up at the top there, right? So this is the main slide. If you remember this and don't remember anything else in the talk, just that'll be fine. So this is the one. Your templates should be declarative and dumb. Your components, try to keep them smart and thin. And your services, fat and happy. And by happy, I'm using that as a code word for specific, all right? And so why? So my experience with following this type of approach is it's made my code more readable, testable, helps us stay dry. I get to leverage Angular features like the async pipe and reduces coupling. So specifically when I say readable, I mean it, of course, makes our code more consistent. And so if people are familiar with your consistent approach, they open up, they're familiar with what they're going to see, right? More readable. Testable. So part of this is we're going to be moving code from our components into our services. And of course, anytime, if you've done any unit testing, you know that services are much easier to test than your components. All right, dry. So don't repeat yourself. This is pretty simple. Code in services is easy to use across multiple components, right? And of course, leverage Angular features. I'm going to show you some examples. I'm a big fan of the async pipe, so I'll be showing you some examples of using that, hopefully using it correctly. And reduce coupling. So we're going to be specific about what parts can talk to which parts, and if you follow that, that'll reduce coupling, especially between, we don't want things like templates talking to services. All right, so templates, as I mentioned, should be kept declarative and dumb. So templates. Templates are the Lloyd Christmas of Angular, right? Obviously dumb here. Declarative, right, makes the view, I mean, he's rocking that orange tuxedo. If anybody knows where I can find a tuxedo, like either the blue one or the orange one, I would appreciate it. All right, I've stopped moving here. There we go. So our templatives should be declarative, not imperative. So when we're talking about declarative code, we're talking about what it needs to do, not exactly how, directing imperatively how it does it. So for a template, specifically, we're talking about your template defining what it wants to show and not exactly how it gets shown. So of course, in the template, we're not going to have any sort of complicated logic, even though you can put long expressions in there. Don't use multiple ands and ors in there, maybe one. Split it up into smaller components, but make sure when you are splitting it up, you're not just adding complexity by splitting it up for splitting's sake. All right. So let's look at an example here. We're going to be looking at a lot of code examples. Is that all right? Everybody likes code? Good. This is the right audience then. So this is a template, and later we'll find out this is actually a template for a container component. And so we're doing ngIf. So one way to keep your templates declarative is to do the ngIf at the highest level possible. So you can see we've got this ngIf here, checking to see that selected task exists before these two subcomponents have to show it. So then the RVA task detail, RVA task history, also, they don't have to check that object is valid. They can just display, right? All right. So I have an example of a declarative component here. You can see it on the right. It's basically, this is part of a search filter for our, we're filtering processes, searching for processes based on state. And they can have any one of these 5 states. So I think I have a live example of this. Right, did it show that? No. Yeah, okay. So of course, when I click on this, you can see aborted turns to true. So this is just a Java objects with a bunch of Boolean flags there, right? So that's how it works. So I wanted to update that. Now, of course, I could have just put 5 buttons on there and attached a Boolean to each, but as I always say, why just engineer something when you can over-engineer it, right? So this is the classic XKCD skit with the cartoon where he's passing this, he says, pass the salt, and he makes the arbitrary condiment dispenser, right? And of course, we know it's all going to save time in the long run, right? So that's what I did. Of course, I created a component for this. So this is an imperative version of the component. So you can see here, basically, we're showing a list of checkboxes. We've got an ng4 there. And so what we're doing is with the ng4, I'm getting the keys of that object. And so we can see that the template here, in this case, it's telling us exactly how to get that list of keys, right? It's saying call the object and get that static keys function and get the keys for the flags. And so we've also got to expose the object here to our template in order for it to be able to use it. All right, so a more declarative way to do this is to have a keys function in your component, and now simply the component handles that, and your template doesn't need to know exactly how the keys are found, right? So in this case, the template is saying what it wants. It's not saying exactly how to get it. So can we refactor more? Any ideas here? I know, because if you're like me, you've never met a piece of code you didn't want to refactor, right? So that's the older version, the declarative version on the left, and the more declarative version, declarativer version on the right. And so what you can see is that we'll just have a states function and let the component deliver the states. And so you might be arguing, well, I like the generic function because I can drop any object in there and get that one, okay? All right, yeah, there's some validity to that, but later on we'll see that in your components, it's often better to have specific functions rather than generic functions. Generic functions tend to work better in services. So anyway, we'll see an example of that later. All right, so that was our declarative templates. So let's talk about keeping our templates dumb. So when a template is dumb, it really should know only about its own component and any sub-templates that it is displaying. And so based on that, templates should never directly access services, only through the functions in the components, right? And I hope that seems like it's obvious, but I have seen code that does this. So what follows is that your services in your constructors of your components should almost always be private. So here's an example of a template talking to directly to the service. So we've got that foo service on the left, get foo. So in this case, the template actually has to know that there is a foo service, and he has to know that there's a get foo on there in order to call it. And so, of course, in our constructor, we have to make the foo service public so that it can be accessed. The better approach here is just to have the get foo function, and now the component is the guy who is actually talking to the service. And I know some people might say, well, the code's a lot longer on the right. Well, yes, but let's look at the template. And if we see in the template is actually shorter, and the template, instead of knowing 2 things, only has to know 1 thing. And if we talk about coupling, this is what the left, you've got the template talking to both the component and the service. And of course, the component always has to talk to the service. So if you count up the arrows, you can say that the bad example is, 50% more coupled than the good example. All right, so let's talk about components. So your components should be smart and thin. So components are the rock climbers of Angular. Obviously, when you're climbing up a rock wall, you don't want any extra weight holding you down. And believe it or not, you actually have to be pretty smart to be a rock climber, at least about rocks, because there's typically only one really easy way to climb the rock. This is actually Tommy Caldwell, one of the best rock climbers in the world. I would argue maybe the best all-around rock climber in the world. He recently, in 2015, with his friend Kevin Jurgensen, did what's been billed as the hardest rock climb ever out in Yosemite, climbed the Dawn Wall. 3,000 feet of solid granite, and they had to do 30 different pitches in that, and so they had to get each one perfect before they could move on to the next one. It took them 19 days. Fun fact, Tommy only has 9 fingers. No, he didn't lose it in a rock climbing accident. Actually, he got in a fight with a table saw won. All right, so this is my friend Lars Brink Nielsen from Denmark. So what he says about components is that they should be lean, mean, view-controlling machines. This is in his talk about components, and you should check it out. Here's the list for that. Lars, like me, likes to talk about Angular architecture. He also, like me, writes a lot of articles for the blog Angular in Depth. Unlike me, Lars is a descendant of Vikings and has a really cool accent. So our components should be smart, and so that they should just be controlling the state of the template, and they're the ones who map the user activity into the services and know where to find everything. Like I mentioned before, the functions in our components should be specific. You want to avoid those generic functions. So a lot of small, specific functions versus just a few big generic functions. And so let's look at an example of what that looks like. So here's kind of a generic type of approach, if you notice up there in the left. So this has an inline template. So I've got 2 buttons up there. I've got a done button and a remove button. And basically what they're doing is they've got this click handler, right? And so the done button calls the handler, passes the done action. The remove one calls the remove, and it gets passed to the action function down there in the lower left, which has an if statement depending on the action. Now, this isn't horrible. It's kind of got a reducer type of feeling to it. But I would argue that a much more readable and simpler approach here is to just have these generic type of, specific functions for done and remove. And then the template, once again, stays dumb. All he needs to know is hey, they click the button, I call this function, right? And the component is the smart one. He knows exactly what to do when the done button is clicked. He calls that specific function on the service. All right. And I did take that code from a real example, the one on the left with the generic. So, even though it seems obvious once you change it, I like that one a lot better. All right. So thin components. We've talked about smart, so let's talk about the thin aspect. So a component's job is to manage the view and invoke the services. So if there's any sort of processing code, you really want to move those into your services. So for example, your components, you really want to avoid injecting the HTTP client service, right? If you've got some sort of REST backend, put that in a service, let that guy inject the HTTP client. All right. So thin components, but why? So one reason is, of course, as I mentioned, it makes it more testable. So we're going to move code from our thin components into our fat services. And of course, services are definitely easier to test. And often you should have, for example, if you're calling some sort of back-end service, that should be a private function if you do have it in the component. But then all you have to do is move it into the service. Now it becomes a public function, easy to test, easy to mock. So keep those components thin. All right. However, let's say I need to add some new functionality to my component. All right. So recently we had a component and it was fetching a list. It's a single server type of approach, and they say, hey, we want to support multi-server. We want to query 10 different servers on the back end, and we want to compose that into a list that's a union of all those. So adding this new code, this new functionality, doesn't it make my component fatter? Well, yes, sometimes it does. So how do we decide whether to put code in the component or the service when it makes it fatter? So do we handle it in the component or do we handle it in the service? How do we decide? Like a boss. Now I know you're saying, okay, we realize you like your GIFs by now, but what does that even mean here, like a boss? What I want you to do is think about your component as being a smart but rather lazy boss, right? So the boss knows exactly what needs to be done in every situation. They make sure it happens. but they delegate it, right? They have people for that. That's their approach, right? Or as a component would say, I have services for that. So the component gets the code that decides, and the service gets the code that processes. All right, so of course, we want to look at a code example of this, right? So we've got this code that decides here. So we've got this, this is a container component. We'll talk about container components here. So he's doing on the ng init. This was, as I mentioned, we had to move from being a single service. So what he does is he just checks to see, are we in multi-service, multi-server mode? If so, he calls the correct service. So this type of deciding code should be in your component. Believe it or not, I wanted to take this deciding code at first and move it into like a service that did this, right? This is because I've probably been drinking the thin component Kool-Aid a little too much, so I'm often tempted to move too much code into my service. But I would say that's the lesser of two evils. So anyway, I'm going to paraphrase Albert Einstein. I mean, every good presentation should have a cool quote from a famous guy like this, right? So Einstein said that everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. So I'm going to say components should be as thin as possible, but no thinner. I really wanted to do this slide, like replace my picture over Albert's and, just do my quote, but I thought, he's comparing himself to Einstein, right? So, all right, so let's talk about the two flavors of components. So we'll have container components and presentation components. So the container components, they're sometimes called smart components. Obviously, for my presentation, I'm going to just call them container components because all components should be smart in my approach here. Although there are presentation components, and they are dumb in a way that they just display data. They're not loading any sort of data. So the container components, those are the top level components, and typically they're being routed to, right? So they're not going to have things like inputs or outputs. And the container components have two main jobs. So organize the presentation components, and then handle the interaction with the backend data services, typically REST type of services, right, where they're loading the lists of data to show in the component. All right, so here's an example of maybe what a container component would look like. So again, their job is to handle the async pipe. So you can see there what it's got. It's actually kind of a bootstrap approach. There's two columns. So we've got tasks up there that would show on the left side of the UI. And then when the user clicks on a task in the list, we get selected task, and then we show the detail and the history of the task there. So again, the container component, we're handling that ngIf at the top level. So these guys down here, task detail and task history, don't have to worry about checking if their object that they're displaying is valid. Okay, so async pipe. I'm a big fan of async pipe. One thing that I hear as a rejection of async pipe is, well, yeah, it gets that data into the template, but I also need it in my TypeScript part of my component, right? So I can't use async pipe because it only puts it into the template. Well, what if we also need the data in that component? You got to tap that observable, right? Jennifer loves tap. She mentioned tap today as one of her three favorite operators on RxJS. So we'll look at an example of how tap works. So I've got a simple component here. Anybody want to take a guess? Container component or presentation component? Come on, this is the audience participation time. Container, thank you. All right. So this is most likely a container component, right? He's got an ngIf there, right? Async pipe, he's loading some data. So we've got that ng pipe that we're using with ngIf to make sure that it's valid. So let's say that I actually need this task that's being loaded. I want to keep a reference to this in my component. So notice I've got the observable there, this.task. So I'm getting the observable from the task service, get task by the ID, and then I just pipe into this tap. So the tap operator basically says, just give me what you have right now in the observable. And so we can just say, this, my task, equals task. And so now that's assigned. And then in this done function, later we can use this dot my task if we need to. Now, this is, I'll admit, a bit of a contrived example because you could actually just pass in the template that task into the done function there. But that messes up my example, so I had to do it this way. All right, so presentation components. So we talked about the container. Presentation components are displayed in the container component. They might also be like a child of another presentation component. All right, and presentation components get data in, and they send events out. And they should always remember the ngIf gets handled at the top level, so those presentation components should always be able to assume that their inputs are valid when they're displayed. All right. Typically, the presentation component is only going to emit the event, and it's going to be the container component at the top level that processes it. And this is because a lot of times the processing that has to happen because of a button is asynchronous, right? So you've got to update different parts. You want to maybe show some sort of loading change in the GUI, and so it's best to handle that at the top level because it might affect multiple presentation components. All right, and then as we saw before, these presentation components, it's really good if when they do emit an event, they emit the object they're displaying. So previously we had this example with the done, right? So it looked like this, and over here we had to do the tap because we want to get access to this my task when it gets loaded. Well, we really don't even need to do this if that task detail component, when it has the done event, just sends us the object the task that it's displaying. Because then that just gets passed into our done function, complete the task, and Bob's your uncle. All right, so services. Services, we want to keep those fat and happy. And of course, I'm using happy just as a special term for specific. All right, now working for a big Japanese company like Fujitsu, you learn a thing or two about sumo. And so sumo, services are these sumo wrestlers of Angular, right? Very big, but they have a very specific task. This is Kiseno Sato Yutaka. And he is actually one of only 3 sumo grand champions currently in the world. And he is actually the only one from Japan. The other 2 are from Mongolia. Kiseno Sato he's a strong guy, but he probably wouldn't help you much on your basketball team. Put him on a football team, he might be a decent center. Probably not going to do much in CrossFit. Maybe a little, not too bad in World's Strongest Man. But if you need somebody pushed out of a 4.5 meter diameter ring, this is your guy. Nobody does it better, right? So that's services for you. They can get big, but they have a very specific job. And so let's talk about services getting fat, right? So all of that processing code gets pushed into your services. So when in doubt about the code, move it into your service. All right. But some of my processing code in my component, it's not used specifically for displaying the view, but it's not like it's going to be shared across multiple components. What do I do about that? Do I really put it in a service? Yes. Just put it in a component-specific service. And can you do that? Yes. It's perfectly fine. Do that. You can have a service for just one component. That's great. As a matter of fact, those are called presenters. Presenters are classes that encapsulate complex data, and they help you in presenting that. So this is what it might look like with our example before. We've got a container component there at the top, and maybe he's of course calling some back-end data service that uses HTTP client, and he's got a presenter service. Maybe it's doing some sort of formatting for the data that he gets back, right? Something like that. And maybe a presentation component has its own presenter down there. This is perfectly fine. And I know some of you may be asking, are you sure that's really a thing? And I can say, yes, I stole it from Lars. So, All right, so presenters. How to implement a presenter, just make a component-specific service. So this is basically an Angular service, and you just drop it into the same folder where that component is with the component.html, the component TypeScript. All right. So we've talked about services getting fat, so let's talk about keeping our services happy. All right, so services are happy when they can focus on doing one thing and doing that one thing well. All right? So happy services are solid. All right, so I often get this question: should services be stateful or stateless? Well, short answer, yes. Right? So some services are going to be stateful, and so examples are those presenters. They might contain state for that component that you're displaying. NGRX store, right? Maybe you've got a state service that covers all the state throughout your application. All of those are good examples of stateful services. You can also have, and you should have, stateless services. So these are, for example, services that help you do some processing, maybe some formatting of data mapping, making HTTP calls to a backend REST API, etc. So when you have these stateless services, you should also favor pure functions in your stateless services. So pure functions, given the same input, you will get the same output, and they don't have side effects. So passing an object into the parameter of a stateless service, you know that that pure function won't change that or mutate that object on you. All right. So we should avoid building state into your processing service, especially those back-end REST API. So you may be tempted to add some sort of like initialize function, right? Because for a back-end system, you need to know certain things about it, like where it's located. You might need to know a server ID, maybe a tenant ID on that server. So you might be tempted to create something like an initialize function where you set all that up. And I can tell you from experience, don't do it. You'll regret it. Trust me on this one. And I know because I did it. So back in the AngularJS days, I did something like this, right? We were only going to ever be talking to one server at a time. I knew it, right? So I created this service that talked to a backend REST, did some gets and posts on my REST API. And so I said, okay, we'll have this server object with the URL, everything I need to know about the server, and you initialize the service and you call it. So all of that is fine, except now you have to remember to call initialize before you call get items. I've got to add code in there error code to tell the developer that, hey, I've checked and you didn't call initialize first, you need to call that. I've got to output all that. So a better way, which when I got to do this again in Angular 2, I did it more like this, which is I have this server factory. And it just creates the server object, and then you just pass that as a parameter every time you call get items. And yes, I know it adds a parameter, but this will make your life so much easier, and I can tell you from experience because remember that where I told you when we had to move that component from being single server on the back end to multi-server on the back end? I could just use this, call it a bunch of times, and zip up those observables, and it was great. All right. So the bottom line is about state and services is that they should either be about managing state and be stateful, or they should be completely stateless. And remember, don't let those templates call those services. Services in the components should always be private. So it should look like this. You've got a template. Your component knows about it. And it's got some sort of data service. And that data service is talking to HTTP client. All right. In summary, templates are the Lloyd Christmas of Angular. Remember, if you remember one thing, just remember this slide. Templates are the Lloyd Christmas of Angular. They're declarative and dumb. Your components are the rock climbers of Angular, smart and thin. Services, Sumo. Fat and happy, specific. Thank you.